Together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, AAPF is glad to welcome you to the final event of our annual Her Dream Deferred series, a talkback for the film we just watched, In Our Mother's Gardens. Thank you all for joining us tonight for In Our Mother's Gardens and throughout the week for other Her Dream Deferred events. What a powerful and inspiring week this has been as we've centered the experiences and healing of Black women and girls. We started out our 7th edition of HDD on Monday with the film On These Grounds, a deeply moving film about the push out of Black girls in our schools and how we may begin to strategize to push back. On Tuesday, we tackled the dangers of various intersectional vulnerabilities that leave Black women at such high risk for maternal mortality with aftershock. And yesterday, we soothed and energized our minds in our self-care event, Labor of Love. Tonight, AAPF is hosting a talkback inspired from In Our Mother's Gardens, which features Black women staff members from the African American Policy Forum. Directed by Chantrell P. Lewis and streamlined through anecdotes shared by and dedicated to Black women, In Our Mother's Gardens is a powerful showcase of Black motherhood, daughterhood, joy, pride, healing, spirituality, and self-care. Per The Hollywood Reporter, Lewis's film centers humor and grace and voices emotions still rarely expressed in stories about Black women. As seen during the screening, the film does everything in its power to convey joy to its viewers, from highlighting cultural foods to the clinking of jewelry. While this approach should not make us forget the generational trauma discussed in the film that Black women have faced, it should make us admire the power that held them then and now. Beloved poet Lucille Clifton wrote, "Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight, my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." So tonight we are celebrating and we are also holding space. We will find joy by dissecting our maternal heritage in a talk back with women from our AAPF community. So please join me in welcoming Shermina Nelson, AAPF's Chief of Staff and Director of Community Engagement, Glenda Smiley, AAPF's Director of Programs and Advocacy, Dr. Venus Evans Winters, our Black Girls Initiatives Research Coordinator, and Chandrea Murphy Washington, our Program Coordinator. I am confident that their stories and insights into Black womanhood and motherhood will spawn an open, thought-provoking, and productive discussion. Now, the film really lays out how our matrilineal lineage can influence the work we feel called to do, which subsequently shapes our lives' paths. My grandmother, for instance, Artemis Tarleton Morris West, was the first Black alderwoman in Natchez, Mississippi. I know her example of political and civic engagement has influenced my own journalism. My mother, Jacqueline Rose West, died when she was 29 years old, suffering a brain aneurysm while she was changing my diaper. I was 18 months old and she was pregnant. So many times in my life, I've been told that, if doctors had listened to her, she could potentially still be alive today. Those facts have heavily influenced my interest in pursuing stories around Black maternal mortality and medical apartheid. Though she did not live to see me, her baby girl, she struggled for 10 years to conceive, turn 2. There is no doubt that she influenced the woman I am today. So I want to open the floor up to you, our illustrious panel here. How has your own matrilineal lineage, this encompasses mothers, both biological or otherwise, mother figures and daughters, informed or shaped your work? Shermina, let's start with you.
Of course. So thank you, Kirsten.
Of course.
So I come from and was surrounded by a community of women who served both in their careers and professional lives. So I was raised to be of service from a really early age. I was taught to volunteer, to give, and I was never allowed to frame it as giving favors. My aunts and my mom, they always would say, there are no favors being done here, right? When you give something from your heart, it's a gift to all parties involved, right? And it comes back around, it's part of being in community. So I was also taught that the community of Black women was a very beautiful community, exceptional community, but also consisted of overqualified and often undervalued individuals. And I was informed of oppression and barriers. So it was always made very clear to me that there was work to be done and that my journey would not be easy. But my mom would always say, you know, when you're walking in your purpose, all things will align, even if it seems difficult at times. So my purpose is deeply founded in those lessons from that community. But how it presents itself is something that wasn't necessarily learned from that community. It's more so nurtured. You know, from a very early age, I was extremely organized. I've always been able to see the big picture or break it down into actionable steps. I see Tetris when something is in front of me. It's intuitive and it's a little bit different from my mother. You know, she was bold and fearless and not as strict and meticulous as I can be, right? She walked into rooms laughing and dancing, and I walk in and I observe, right? I dance when I'm warmed up, but she never judged that. She always encouraged me to lean into my gifts. She was very clear that I was not to compromise my skill or diminish my form of light or make it look more like hers or anyone else's. And I think a lot about her and also my Aunt Vanessa, who made it really okay for me to be different, to see things different. My Aunt Vanessa taught me that I could have it all. I could be strategic, I could be structured, I could be creative. She taught me to bake, she taught me to sing. And all of my aunties encouraged my fashion sense and love of decorating, and, you know, probably to my detriment, because I definitely shop too much, thanks to my mom and aunts. So yeah, I'm really thankful that I've been able to find spaces where I can be all of those things, where I can organize and strategize and throw in some artistic creativity. And one thing I'll just leave with, though, that's important to note, that the physical loss of a large part of my lineage greatly shapes who I am. It informs my work. So I gravitate towards mental health work, particularly trauma, grief, and loss, because it's a huge part of my human experience. And I have both a personal and academic understanding of it. So it's a place where I add insight and value. I believe it guides my work at AAPF with the Say Her Name campaign specifically. And it guides my unwavering commitment to racial justice work, because unfortunately, trauma and loss is woven throughout the Black experience. And so this is why I do what I do. It's important for me to say that I'm not burdened with the responsibility of the loss. It strengthens my commitment to my work. It pushes back on my fear and imposter syndrome. And, you know, I am because they said it so. And I carry the dream, as, you know, as my mom told me to. So.
Thank you, Shamina. Mothers are so impactful on our lives in so many ways. Glenda, what about you?
Thank you, Kirsten, for the question. And thank you, Shamina, for sharing about your family. My name is Glenda Nicole Jeanette Smiley, daughter of Patrice Smith Smiley. She's in the red there. Daughter of Marion Hinton Smith, daughter of Romelia Stevenson Hinton, daughter of Priscilla Stevenson. And I'll shout out my Aunt Val. She has the red stole on, and she just graduated from college last year. The women in my family have taught me the importance of doing heart-centered work, both at home and in the world. So I share that in common with Shamina. They are the women on my matrilineal line, as well as my paternal side, are fierce lovers, hard workers, dedicated mothers and homemakers, extraordinary cooks, and many of them are partnered, not all of them, but I will say all of them are clearly independent women, partnered or not, creatives, visionaries, and dreamers who often had to defer some of their dreams to elevate the important work of motherhood. They are women who are all about sisterhood and showing up for their people. They are givers and gatherers, and that has been the core of my work, gathering communities of youth, of women, of Black women and girls in particular, and young Black professionals also, to learn, to heal, to celebrate ourselves and our history, to excavate and offer up our talents and purpose, and to direct that talent purpose towards building futures that are more loving, equitable, and inclusive for Black folks. I have to say, in addition to my biological mothers, I have been so blessed with spiritual and intellectual mothers. One in particular is Yolanda Wisher. She was my high school English teacher. She recently was the Poet Laureate of Philadelphia. But in my high school, Germantown Friends School, which is a PWI, she was the advisor of the Sisters Affinity Group. She was the advisor of the Poetry Club. And she kind of taught me what culture work was in action. During my senior year, I had an independent study with her, and she took me to she walked me around the corner, took me to Sonia Sanchez's house, and I just sat there in conversation with them about womanhood and art and advocacy and what Professor Kimberly Crenshaw calls artivism. And it is that memory that kind of grounds and propels the work that I'm doing now, the importance of tying the present to the past and the future in real time. And so I'll pause there and toss it back to you, Kristen. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Glenda. Venus, please share your thoughts. Is Dr. Venus with us? No.
I'm here. I want to thank the AAPF staff for unmuting me. So let me just say, Kristen, I am my mother's child, who is my grandmother's child. All the women in my family embody this feminine fire, but my grandmother, Charlie Mae, carried a gun, and my mama, Quincella Peaches, cussed like a sailor and smoked like chimneys, and they loved very hard. Our mothers are uprooted from the indigenous lands of the southern parts of the United States, Mississippi, and the south side of Chicago. You see, I said the south side of Chicago. And the men in my family protected women, and the women in my family too knew that they had what it took to defend and to protect Black women. I definitely bring that fierce feminine warrior spirit to my research, writing, and my advocacy work. I know because of them that my fire can warm a village or burn the village down. I was encouraged to never to apologize for using my power to defend myself, my brother, or my sister, and anybody who could not defend herself. The women in my family have always stood on the side of humanity, always. And for me, I would say almost 20 years now, I've been researching, writing, and publishing and speaking on Black daughters' relationships with their mothers. And I'm walking in the spirit of Bell Hooks, Alice Walker, and Zora Neale Hurston. And I am unapologetically a truth teller. In fact, as evidence of this work just sitting here, I want to thank those of you who DM me. And Sonia, she shot her shot. And so we'll be having a conversation. So I really, truly do believe in not only being a truth teller, but also passing the torch. I think that's very important, Sankofa, looking back in order to know how to move forward so that we can understand where we are today. And so definitely walking in the spirit of my mother and my foremothers as I lift, as I climb, and being unapologetically and unabashedly a truth teller.
Absolutely. If Black women don't do nothing else, we tell the truth. Thank you so much, Venus. Thank you. Chandrea, please share with us.
Thank you, Kirsten, and amen, Dr. V. If we don't do nothing else, we will tell the truth, our truth at that. But I mentioned during our discussion of On These Grounds on Monday that I was a caregiver for my mother, but what I didn't mention is that I took on that role at the age of 6. Not only that, but I wasn't the only child in the house. I also have an older sister who has developmental disabilities who needed my care as well. So basically, since almost the beginning of my life, I've existed in this kind of in between space of trying to learn to mother and daughter simultaneously. But before my mother's illness got the best of her, like her mental health, she was my hero. Like I watched her provide food to the neighborhood kids whose families couldn't afford food. I watched her run to the doors of our neighbors whose houses were on fire to make sure that nobody was trapped inside. So to me, she was invincible. And so once her mental health began to deteriorate and she no longer had that capacity to be that hero, I didn't have a choice but to lean on the other women in my life, like my sisters and my grandmother and the other mothers who were in my neighborhood, who so willingly just stepped up to offer me that guidance without me even having to ask them. And seeing how they did that really kind of set the stage for what was going to become my career path later in life. And so like I had no idea what I wanted to do, but like I just knew I wanted to be able to step into those roles that those women filled for me and be able to be there for girls like me who were growing up with a key piece of the person who is put in our lives to guide us, incapable of doing that. And so I ended up going to school to learn about people and then learning how to serve them. So I got my degrees in anthropology for my human understanding, and then my master's degree in public service so that I could be well equipped to produce the types of services that I would have needed as a child. And while I was getting those degrees, it helped me to start doing consulting work for youth serving organizations within my community, which ultimately led to my role here as a program coordinator with AAPF, where I get to sit down with and act as a thought partner to brilliant people like Dr. Venus and Shamina and Glenda, who are also very passionate and dedicated to serving the same vulnerable population. One of the initiatives here that I feel the closest to personally is our Young Scholars Program, where we not only focus on the academic and career development of Black girl youth, but we also focus on their well-being and their sense of self. And like in this role, we are serving young people who come from all types of different walks of life, all different experiences, different socioeconomic levels, have different responsibilities and ambitions. And, we don't care what you may have gone through prior to your contact with AAPF, then like that never dissuades us from stepping into that role of educator or friend or auntie if you need us, because we not only want to see you grow, but we want to see you love yourself while you do it. And I just can't think of a better place for me to be positioned to continue to carry out the legacies of all these women who poured into me.
Wow. We can sit with that for a second, because that's kind of a thread through all of what you all said, is how important our relationships with our mothers and what they taught us, and not just what they taught us, but their own experiences, how that pours into us and impacts us in ways we might not even realize until later. Thank you all for sharing that very, very much. Dr. Venus, I have a question for you. We've talked about how it impacts our work. What thoughts, feelings, emotions came up for you as you watched this film? Why do you think that centering this matrilineal lineages was so important?
Thank you, Kirsten. And what comes to mind for me is power. Power. People are afraid of Black women's and girls' power. Whether we are looking forward to Africa or looking back to Africa, people understand that Black women, we are the keepers of the secret. Our mothers, as we sat between their legs and got our hair did, or what we heard and saw at the kitchen table, or sitting in the church pews, or watching our mothers at the spades tables, us daughters, we hold the knowledge that we need to survive in this current world. Us daughters, we have the knowledge that we need to survive and to liberate our people, to be clear. I'm convinced that the answers and the weapons that we need are in these matrilineal knowledges. This film, Kirsten, right? It's about remembering our mother's knowledge, her mother's knowledge, and her mother's knowledge. The film responds to what it is we need also, I believe, to heal, to live liberated lives. to get free. Who are we as a cultural people and as a spiritual tribe? After 400 years of colonization, enslavement, and dehumanization, what is it that we need as a people to return to our righteous place in human history? I believe the women folk know. And so what comes to mind for me is power. As you've said about your mother, as Sharmina has said about her mother and other mothers, and even as Glenda and Chandrea have spoken about their mothers, we know so much because of the time that we've spent with our mothers who spent time with their mothers and so forth. Power. And I hope that all of us can sit with that. What does power look like as a manifestation of our relationships with our mothers and our foremothers and our daughters?
Power is very interesting because, you know, they talk about how the victor tells history's tale, right? And the stories that have been stolen from us by the society that we live in, because we have not had the transmission of knowledge that we need, because so many of our mothers have been taken from us early. I got that in the film. You could see that just even seeing them framed like that, right? Like we're creating moving pictures and living legacies with our mothers and through ourselves. So power, thank you for that so much. I want to kind of shift a little bit because so much, and you all talked about a little bit, the work that we all do, but specifically in the context of this year's edition of Her Dream Deferred, how do you relate the ways in which your ancestry and lineages show up in who you are today and your approaches to social justice advocacy specifically? So I know, Chandrea, you can talk a little bit about, and Dr. Venus a little bit about On These Grounds. So Venus, let's stay with you.
So what comes to mind for me is in the documentary On These Grounds, Vivian Anderson, who's now in South Carolina, she discussed that her reaction when she first saw the video of Shakara, the student in high school at the time, 16, who was slammed to the ground by an adult male white resource officer. And in that slam, which many of us, you know, I see we have a lot of people who are returning back from watching and joining us this week. And also people probably, if you've been close to social media or the news, you definitely saw that slam that was seen around the world. I felt it, Kirsten. I felt her fear. I felt her shame and humiliation when she was slammed. I was furious. I wanted to fight. And I thought to myself, what would mama do? What would grandma do? They'll grab their gun. I was actually concerned that you had so many bodies, 15, 16 bodies, young people who bared witness to that assault and that abuse against a fellow Black girl. Now, Kirsten, because I heard you talk about it. Now, I know where we from, right? One fight, we all fight. That's
Everybody.
how we was raised.
Everybody, yes.
Everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're seeing is we're seeing young people who aren't defending their own. Now, we don't advocate violence here at AAPF. What we do advocate is policy reform. What we do advocate is documenting these abuses or transgressions or illegal acts.
We know there's different ways to fight, right?
That's right.
Right.
And so what would grandma do? Grandma would grab her gun. Okay, I didn't grab my gun, but I grabbed my pen, which you choose to do as well. And so I grabbed also Black girls and Black women in that moment. Now my advocacy now is centers compassion and love for the struggle. My mama and grandmama and aunts, they taught me that protect your peace and center yourself around others who seek peace, Kirsten, by any means necessary. Okay, so my mother was a feeler. And when you feel, you have to accept that you've been called to action. You've been called to move. If you don't move, you will become sick. A warrior must move when activated. So I choose in these moments to move in love, Kirsten.
Preaching. Love. I think one of the things I think about your grandmother grabbing her gun, right? is sometimes people think love is weak or it's a soft emotion. It's not.
They haven't had children yet.
Without a blink. You do what you have to do. Chandrea, how's it impact your work, sis?
It's funny that Dr. Venus mentioned her grandmother, because this also these grounds films also made me think about my grandmother, but not my grandmother on my gun pulling side. But my grandmother, Dora Thomas, who is also still one of my best friends to this day and will be for the rest of our lives. But she worked for over 30 years as an educator in the Arkansas Prison School District. She was actually one of the founding teachers in the district, and she did tenures in both the men's and the women's unit. And she was like the most instrumental in shaping who I am and the work that I do. And even though she worked with people who were incarcerated, she never looked at them as criminals, regardless of what they were accused of or what their convictions were. And she also never allowed the inhumanity that other workers in the prison system practiced to seep into who she was and to change how she treated people. She saw those individuals as people who were just as deserving of a quality education and enriching programs as everybody else who wasn't incarcerated. And in that work, she helped develop a library in the prison and got donations of books from churches and the local libraries and everything. She started a theater program that allowed them to practice like Shakespeare and put on performances for people, and even had President Clinton coming out to performances and stuff for people who were incarcerated when he was the governor of Arkansas at the time. But she gave them so much hope, and not caring what they was coming from or not caring what their backgrounds were or what they had done. And like, that's why the discussion of On These Grounds was so important to me, because the ways in which the school to prison pipeline is trapping so many of our Black girls and gender expansive youth that are really in dire need of supportive services that center their mental health, that's heartbreaking when you see how they're doing that. The idea that a child is more deserving of punitive punishment than support, attention, and care, that shouldn't sit right with anybody. And every child deserves to have somebody standing in their corner, particularly the ones who are already dealing with trauma. And like, they deserve to have their voices and experiences amplified, so that we can get to the root of exactly where these systems are continuing to fail them and exactly what they need to feel supported. And they deserve our action on our behalf. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Glenda, you can speak to us a little bit about Aftershock.
Yes, I can, Kirsten. So on Tuesday, we showed the film Aftershock, and we had a powerful talkback discussion moderated by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who joined filmmakers Tanya Lewis-Lee and Paula Eizelt, along with the cast members Omari Maynard, Shawnee Benton Gibson, and Bruce McIntyre III. And so that conversation illuminated the systemic and racial, ethnic disparities associated with pregnancy-related deaths in the US. And what it brought up for me as a mother, as a new-ish mother too, is my own experience birthing, but also what I learned about my mother and my grandmother and my auntie's experience birthing, because I had to have an emergency C-section. It wasn't until they were in the hospital with me where they were like, this happened to me too, and me too, and me too. So it just made me think about the importance of sharing our birthing histories. It made me think about the physiology of birthing and how close our bodies are to our mothers and our aunties and our grandmothers. And if we just share a little bit, it could help us with our future birthing plans. And then the other piece that it reminded me of in regards to what my mother shared with me immediately after my birthing experience is just how the quality of care while Black women are birthing and immediately afterwards still continues to be poor and dangerous. So for my mother, who had to have an emergency C-section, her scar also got infected. And so it was just like this ongoing trauma that was so traumatic for her that she decided not to have any other children. And also seeing me go through my experience kind of re-traumatized her. So she was kind of in and out of the hospital room when I was in the middle of my emergency. It was like quite the experience to go through myself, but also witness what was coming up for her. And so this film Aftershock, I think, will be an important advocacy tool, not only for us to advance policies around maternal health in the US, but hopefully to also inspire women and women's lovers and caretakers to have these important conversations about our experiences and our birthing choices, whether we choose to give birth in a hospital or at home, or whether we go to a birthing center.
You know, it's so interesting, and I shared a little bit in my intro, is that's also the reason why, you know, I'm also passionate about that work as well, because my whole life I heard that, you know, there's a possibility your mother would still be alive if she had been listened to, if she had a system that listened to Black women. You know, it was not an aneurysm there. Sometimes there are warnings, and she had them. So, you know, for her to be 29 and struggle for 10 years and then die, you know, at 29 when I'm 18 months old, really has grounded my care in this work. And we talk about epigenetics and weathering in so many ways that Black women's bodies are just ignored and dehumanized. And it's just such important work. And I'm glad to be in it with all of you all. Sharmina, talk to us a little bit about Labor of Love.
Yes, so on Wednesday, we hosted a Labor of Love, Cultivating Restorative Spaces for Women Activists, Healers, and Caregivers. And that event featured conversations with wellness and mental health practitioners, meditations, self-care practices. One thing I reflect on a lot when I think of my mother and other maternal figures in my life is how often they poured from their cups without refill, right? How much they struggled, how much they sometimes had to just be in survival mode, right? Didn't necessarily have the privilege, or at least, you know, the knowledge that they could take a break, right? Or how to take those breaks, or how to practice self-care. So when we were planning this year's event, Venus and Awoye and I thought a lot about all that Black women have endured and continue to endure, and what's needed, right, for us to live full lives while we continue, you know, on this journey, while we continue the mission of service. You know, we are, as Black women, often required to be all things while living in a society that sometimes tell us that we're nothing, or we're less than, right? The actions of the society, the laws, the policies, I mean, they send that message to us. You know, we serve without being served. We labor, and our labor is acknowledged with more labor, right? And so we're not going to stop doing the work. We're not going to become less exceptional. So what can we put in place, you know, internally, or even in our communities, to really foster just activities of care to encourage us to take that moment? And so when Venus pitched the idea of the title, Labor of Love, right, I thought a lot about our dearly departed Bell Hooks. And I started thinking more about, and we're still sort of playing around with this idea of this force field of love, right? What kind of protection can we create for ourselves, or what kind of protection can we create as a community to combat our daily adversity? Every day we wake up, I mean, there is oppression, there are microaggressions at work, in schools, there's tragedy, there's trauma, there's so much there, and we still persist. So we have to have, you know, those tools in place. Yeah. So Venus, I'll let Venus weigh into, since she was a part.
Yeah, I think, Sharmina, that's the brilliance of AAPF, right? So as was said in the movie, we pick our families people of African ancestry, we've never had the privilege of simply only naming our birth families or our biological connections. So we chose AAPF and AAPF chose us. What's interesting is Awoye is an artist by trade, right? You're an artist too, but Sharmina is also an attorney by trade and also a licensed clinical social worker. And so I'm also a licensed clinical social worker as well as a research and policy scholar. So it's like we took the charge, right? And so I like to say that, I am a baby of the civil rights movement. I'm a affirmative action baby and I'm a feminist baby, right? And so one of the charges of the civil rights movement is that all these, the Black elders and activists basically said, we're going to need Black nurses, Black lawyers, Black social workers, and Black educators, right, Sharmina? And so they knew that we would have a moment like today. So earlier today, Professor Crenshaw and our TBT team, Truth Be Told team, they just finished a symposium or conversation titled Backlash to Racial Justice. So even this fight to protect anti-racist education and our right to speak out against racial bias, is now being threatened. But freedom is work. Protection is work. And what would working on behalf of love for humanity, plant life and animal life as well, what would it look like in a society with a history of terror and trauma? So cultivating space, caregiving practices, and embracing and respecting our roles as healers is exactly what AAPF centers, right? And so, and these conversations about healing, caregiving, and being in service too is actually taken up from an intersectional prism. So this idea of a labor of love is groundbreaking. It's groundbreaking. And we can only think of that because very rarely is policy done with Black women and girls' needs at the center. So quite naturally, love will be at the center.
Absolutely. I think about trauma. Many of you all have touched on trauma, and that the film elevates that. We've talked a lot about weathering and the fact that what stress does to the body and how stress, causes all kinds of ailments and raises cortisol and what that looks like and how that feels. Black women in particular, I feel, between microaggressions and larger aggressions, are always dealing with some kind of trauma, whether we necessarily realize it or not. And it goes back generations, right? When we talk about slavery, it's not often framed around the fact that Black women had to be sexually assaulted and raped for slavery to continue. When we talk about reproductive justice and police brutality, Black women's children are being murdered in the streets. All of that is trauma. What are the ways that you see generational trauma manifesting itself in Black women?
Kirsten, I know because, before we all said roll call, we made some agreements that we wouldn't go too deep, so that we would,
we can back it up.
We don't want to mess up our mascara, while we're on camera, but I think this is an important question. And what I do want to say for our audience, trauma is real. Trauma is real, and everything that we do here at AAPF, we're doing it on the front lines, even if it's virtually. So even when Ma'Khia Bryan was killed, I watched that video 12 times before I told myself to shut it off, but I had to do it. We had to do it as a team, as an AAPF staff team, the Black Girls Matters team, and the Young Scholars, because we need to be able to analyze truth from fiction, and we need to make policy recommendations based off facts. So trauma is real. And for all the reasons named in the film, trauma is also real. But what I do want us to know is that trauma can manifest biologically, Kirsten. It can manifest environmentally and also spiritually. And, because I deal with Western science, but if we had to take it from a non-Western side, we can talk about the spiritual the spiritual cost of trauma, but also how we can use spirituality to recover from trauma. So biologically, Kirsten, I just heard for the first time your mother died young. My mother died young, right? And so how is that going to manifest biologically? And then what her mother and my grandmother and great grandmother's experience. Now people are referring to it as wound trauma, but what I can tell you for the sake of time is definitely stored in our DNA from a scientific perspective. And now I speak as a clinician. It's also environmental. Kirsten, imagine your grandmothers and your aunts. They just lost a daughter or a sister. How is that going to affect your communication? How is it going to affect me and your communication with our daughters, our sons, right? And so how we talk, how we react, how we don't respond, how we love. I said my parents loved hard, right? And spiritually, what was lost during the transatlantic slave trade? What was beat out of us? What was raped out of us? Attempted to be beat and raped out of us, okay? But we can use that same knowledge, right, to we're not only going to embody trauma, but we can also use it to embody resilience. Our bodies, our DNA also remembers our resilience. Thank goodness it does, right? So we can actually counteract what we are referring to as weathering, the deterioration of the Black woman's body due to past and contemporary forms of trauma. And that's what I would say. That's why it's important that we fetch backward in order to move forward. Healing is an individual choice, but as we said with the labor of love and some of our other films like Aftershock, it's also a communal practice. It's a communal practice. And as someone here at a think tank, as someone who's here at a think tank, right? It's also a set of policies, Kirsten. So we have to be very, very careful, not only to think about what we need to do as a community or as individuals, but also collectively, how are we going to advocate for policies that acknowledge the abuses of our government and the intersectional failures of our government so that we can heal and so that policies can mitigate the trauma that's currently being done and prevent any future chronic stress, toxic stress, or trauma.
You know, you raised something interesting because I think about Black women and resilience and strength. And it's like, you know, we also deserve lives of ease, right? Mm-hmm. And peace. Enjoy. Like, don't you get tired sometimes of everybody congratulating us on how resilient and strong we are?
Very much so.
It's a survival tactic, right?
Very much so. Very much so. So we have to also, if we're going to talk about resilience, we also have to talk about systems and governmental responsibilities. Right. And we also have to talk about agency. Mm-hmm. And vulnerabilities. Yes. So resilience for us is not enough.
and where are we and with whom are we safe to be vulnerable? What system allows that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We'll be here all night. Glenda, what are your thoughts, sis?
Thank you for that, because the vulnerability piece is really, really real. I just wanted to add to what Dr. Venus said about trauma and add that I think it's really important to talk about how trauma sits and settles into our body, because it's also a discussion, it's tied to a discussion of what we must do to uproot and move pain so that it doesn't result in disease, whether that's disease of the mind, body, or spirit. And what I didn't share about my mother is that she actually had a hysterectomy in her mid to late 30s. And now here I am in my mid 30s preparing for a surgery that's connected to my reproductive organs. Not a hysterectomy, but a cyst that I will likely have to have removed. And so I've been thinking a lot about the chakras associated with the physical manifestation of pain that my mother has carried and the pains that I have carried and what that means for the work that I must do, right? Not as a replacement to what the doctors are going to do, but what I need to do before surgery and after surgery to really elevate joy, to center joy in my life and ease, like you said, Kirsten, to ground myself more, to water my creative ideas, to be in communities of love and care and adventure and joy. And so I just wanted to elevate that as well.
Yes, yes, so important. You know, in the film, one of the mothers says, forgetting is a form of death.
Mhm. Mhm.
Forgetting is a form of death. And with the loss that so many of us in this space have experienced, as a community that we've experienced, as a people we've experienced, it's so important that we don't forget. So Shameen, I'm going to start with you. What do you want to make sure not to forget about your mother?
I mean, there's so much, you know, and for anyone who's lost anyone, you know, you try to remember, you know, their voice. That's a big one. And, you know, thankfully we're in a time now where we have cell phones and so forth. But the thing about my mother that I think about a lot, is slightly funny, but serious at the same time, is that my mom was sort of heavy-handed. So if she hugged you, it would feel like she's like breaking your shoulders. Or if she's holding your hand, right? If she's the person you're standing next to on the prayer circle, just know you're going to have to, your hand, you would literally be wringing your hand out. But now, you know, with her being gone, I think about that a lot, because even if my hand hurt, I remember always feeling safe. The way she hugged you, the way she held you, always felt like, I got you, I have you. And so that's the thing I try to remember most. And I'll share this in this space. I don't know if many people know this because I do this privately. When I have moments where I feel alone, which we can feel, you know, because she's not physically here. And a lot of my family's not physically here, my aunts and my grandparents and so forth. I do this, I take my hands and I just hold really, really tight, like as tight as I can, and just take really deep breaths. And for a moment, I can feel her. And I don't ever want to forget that feeling of being held, right? It's like, you know, we have now the weighted blankets, but it's a different kind of weighted blanket to really just ease anxiety, ease the fear of being alone, because you're never ever alone. Yeah.
Let's sit with that one for a second. Glenda, what do you not want to make sure you don't forget about your mother?
That's a powerful, beautiful question, Kirsten. And I'm still sitting in what Shamina shared, but I will say that one of the things that I don't want to forget, but also I'm aspiring to reach in real time, is the way my mother loves through action. And I'm trying to emulate how she loves in action in a way that still honors my need to rest and to have ease. But my mother is the type of woman who shows up literally for me now in this continuous pandemic phase. My mom travels from Philadelphia to North Jersey, right outside of New York City, where I live, to be with me half of the week, to support me and Zora. And then when she's not here, she's still going into the office on Thursday and Friday. And so that is an example of her selflessness and her love and her unwillingness to see me struggle unnecessarily. And because I'm fortunate enough to have a mother who shows up in that way, I do think it's my calling to show up for my sister friends and other folks who don't have that, because where we don't have our mothers, we have village, right? We have family by choice. And so that's something I don't want to forget about my mother. And I want the remembrance to look like embodying that for the people who I love.
Those tears are good, sis. Good and necessary.
So Kirsten, I've had the privilege of reading your work and following you on social media. And I've been so authentic about my relationships with my mothers as a daughter. In fact, I pull from all of the energy of all the daughters, in these spaces that I've had the privilege and honor of walking in and being in community with. And it's really interesting to me because I like to remind people that when it comes to Black women, we're actually more likely to be a daughter than we are a mother. And so I think about my mother, possibly your mother, they actually were daughters longer than they were mothers. And now we're still daughtering. And, most of us are still trying to figure out now how to transition into eldership so that we can become good ancestors. So not all of us here will be mothers, but all of us here will be daughters. And I think that it's something to exploring that. Who are we as daughters, and how does that manifest who we will become as mothers or other mothers, or as Chandrea said, aunties and big sisters and play cousins. And I believe that we can't. So with that said, I was going to say, so in reading your stuff and my stuff and other people's stuff, the one thing that I would say, I pray to God herself that I never lose my mother's tongue and her fortitude. So I know that Black people, Black women, we're becoming more uncomfortable with the term resilience, but something that Sharmina and I will tell you as clinicians, resilience is a good thing, but you cannot have resilience without resistance. That's the part that our European counterparts will not talk about in the science or public conversations around resilience. And so even our fight here at AAPF for our right to resist, our right to protest, our right to engage in civil engagement, that's a part of our resilience. We can't have resilience without resistance. And so I pray that these European institutions, these capitalist institutions, does not ever cut off my tongue, because that's what I get from my mama. She get it from her mama.
Listen, that's a big one. That's a big one. How Black women are asked to contort and adjust and squeeze ourselves into these spaces where we aren't allowed to bring our full authentic selves, and we have to make sure we do not lose our tongues. That's amazing. I had a sister tell me once before, we don't have to do things the same way, that we're in positions, in different positions for a reason. We don't have to model what has been modeled for us. We don't have to dehumanize each other the way we've been dehumanized. There are other ways. And, to disrupt these systems and resist within these systems is so, so important until we can dismantle them. So that's another conversation for another time. That also leads beautifully into another question I wanted to ask you. You kind of touched on it, is for girls, our first identity is daughter. And from daughter, we grow into learning who we are. And that, of course, impacts what kind of mothers we will be, what kind of sister we'll be, how we show up in community. We are first daughters. And that's so powerful to me, that your frame of reference in life is as a daughter. And I think about, how do we create our own gardens? Do we have to uproot and build our own gardens? Are we responsible for just making sure that we cultivate our mother's gardens to pass it on? And I just want to lift in the comments that someone said how difficult it was for this conversation because she had to walk away from her mother's family. That too is a trauma. That too informs and shapes who we are as people. Even if we have to walk away from our mother's families, we still are informed by those relationships, whether they're flourishing or healthy or not. How do we create our own gardens? Venus, I want to stay with you for a little bit, and then Sharmina, I want to hear from you. Chandra, I'm sorry, I want to hear from you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kirsten. And I do believe that we have a responsibility to document our histories, her stories. I do. I would tell anybody, we come out of the oral tradition. Now, don't get me wrong. We were the first scientists, to be clear. We were the first explorers, right? The first university, Timbuktu in Africa, for the record. But as an oral people, we have been stripped of some of our documented history, right? And so I do believe that we have a responsibility to the culture, to humanity, Kirsten, that cultivation of these gardens, it starts with us. I don't care if you write it in a journal. As a sister scholar here out of University of South Carolina, Janice Baines, who's the student of Gloria Boutte, and she contacted me to tell me after her grandmother passed away, she found her grandmother's journals. Now, her grandmother, by our standards, wasn't an illiterate person. And this is before Oprah told us to keep gratitude journals. And so for me, obviously, as a woman who's a scholar of Black women's thought, I thought, oh my God, that's an artifact. Y'all, we got artifacts all around our mothers and grandmothers and aunties and them houses. They write it on a piece of papers, right? My grandma used to write in a notebook. They put it on receipts. We have diaries, we have journals. They don't have to be the fancy, Target 1999 journals, right? They might be the little dollar store journals, or, a piece of notebook that they have sitting in their pocketbook. But we can do that. Sometimes social justice work is somebody has to be the keeper of the secrets. And so, Kristen, I'm not saying that we start over because we got a lot, right? So there were African women on the slave ships, right? And they would braid in their hair, right? Little beads and little tokens of memory, little rices, so that people knew exactly where they came from. That's in here. That's in here in our gut. That's right here. So that's why we have to go back to our indigenous and spiritual practices. And that's what Chantrell was telling us in this movie. It's in our speech, it's in our hair, it's in our womb knowledge, it's in our hearts, it's in our souls. Now, I know we don't like to talk religion in the West or spirituality, but that's where we start. We are the gardens. We are the gardens. That seed is here. It's been planted. And intentionally, don't take it from our mothers, intentionally planted.
Ashe says, we are the garden. It's hard to destroy those seeds. We are the garden. I love that. Sharmina, Chandra, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Kirsten. And once again, we have Dr. Venus in here dropping all the gems. It's so hard to follow. But let me first off start by saying how happy I am to be privileged enough to be gardening during a period when we have access to self-care and mental health resources and practitioners that the generations that came before us didn't have access to. And so for me, creating my garden started with figuring out what I wanted to grow and who I was growing it for. And so, because when you begin your life strictly focusing on the care of other people, it's easy to confuse what people want from you with what you want for yourself. And there were so many times in my life when I couldn't see past being a caregiver, and I never thought I was going to be anything more, not because I didn't want to be anything else, but because that had been the only consistent thing in my life. That was the only job that I really knew. And so I had to start by planting seeds of faith. And when I say faith, I'm not talking about necessarily in the biblical sense, but faith in the sense of believing that if I wanted something bad enough, and if I worked towards it and put myself in a place to receive it, that whatever it was I was going after would come for me or come to me. And that sometimes meant like setting goals and making dreams that I knew I didn't have the money or the experience to fulfill. But oftentimes I really do feel like I shot for the stars and landed on the moon, and that got me out of where I was, and that's all I needed. And so for my own daughter, I want her to grow up with a strong foundation of who she is and an understanding of what she wants, and not have to deal with pruning out all of her insecurities and all the perceptions of other people before her garden can bloom. And so in order for her to do that, I've started doing the work to pull up the weeds from my own garden, those weeds of self-doubt and neglect of self and being afraid of taking up space. And I started planting seeds of joy and self-assurance and self-love and healing and rest, so that she can live, not just live in her fullness, but she can define what that fullness means for herself. And I want that same thing for my son and for every young person and every person, period, that I come into contact with.
You better preach, because I got a lot of weeding to do my damn self. A lot of weeding to do. Glenn, I know we're running a little bit low on time, but I really just want to hear Shamina and Glenda's thoughts, if you all have some briefly.
Yeah, like you say, Kristen, you know, my identity was largely shaped, you know, as a daughter, you know, so my garden consisted of seeds planted by my mother and my aunts and my grandmothers. You know, my Aunt Vanessa taught me kindness, and my grandma T, whose birthday is today, she's 96. She taught me family. My grandma Timmons, she taught me, you know, the art of a compliment. You could walk in feeling or looking some kind of way, and she would go, "Ooh, you look so good." And you're like, "No, I don't." But okay, thanks, Grandma Timmons. And, you know, and my mom Williams, she taught me honesty. Because you could walk in there and she could say, "Girl, you're getting a little fat." Like, what you been doing? And my Aunt Shamina taught me boundaries, which I'm still working on. And my godmother B, you know, she planted seeds of just showing up, and she's shown up so much since all of the people I've named, you know, with the exception of my grandma T, are no longer physically with me. And my godmom is here. And so she shows up literally here, you know, even if I'm doing AAPF merchandise, B is in here with me. And so, you know, they've all taught me how to, you know, to make it work, right? So those, you know, they've been planting seeds all of my life. And then sometimes there are figures in my life that had no business planting seeds in my garden, right? So I had to do a bit of work, you know, finding my garden and also tending to my garden, you know, trimming. I when I was reflecting on this, I thought about my trimming of my selflessness, because I've been taught to be selfless and just give it all, you know, and trimming a little bit of that, right, to better take care of myself, and planting more seeds of grace, you know, for myself and for others, and moving away from right and wrong in relationships. My mom used to say, "You want to be right or you want to get it right?" Right? Like, what you sure you want to be right? Or do you actually want to be in a relationship and get things where they need to be? And so I work on that in my garden. And I want my garden to hold space for the experiences of others without creating shadows that stunt my own growth. I want my garden to hold joy that's not moved or shaken. Another mom, I'll give you another mom, Regina Wisdom. I used to say, I'm just not happy. And she told me, "Do me a favor and stop looking for happy and find you some joy." She said, because joy says no matter what's going on around you, it's going to be okay. Happy says, you know, when things come in and out, you had a party, someone gave you something, but, you know, find joy. So I want my garden to hold joy. I want my garden to have generational wealth, and not necessarily financial, you know, just those lessons, those things that are not quantifiable, but they definitely bear fruit. And yeah, I want to live a life that when I'm physically gone, the way we've been speaking of those who've gone before us, that people will remember me kindly. And if not, I hope they at least, you know, respect my journey. And I just want to continue to just be better at listening, sitting, you know, and being able to hear even when there are no words being said. So.
Ashe. Glenda.
Beautiful, Sharmina. And yes, I'll jump in, Kirsten. So Alice Walker writes, in search of my mother's garden, I found my own. And I've learned to create my own garden by watching the women in my life, my mother, my mentors, also by starting to create intentional self-care practices, even when I didn't know that that's what I was doing. So when I was a kid and I was stressed as an only child, I journaled a lot. I wrote poetry. I created greeting cards. I thought I was going to be the next Hallmark. I really did. And so I've continued with some of those practices in my adult life. I've also learned to create my own garden by reading and taking in the gems of womanist writers and culture workers like Toni Cade Bambara, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Zora Neale Hurston, who my daughter is named after. I've learned by experimenting, and I thank my parents for being open to my experimentation as a child, everything from converting to Islam when I was in high school and experimenting with Buddhism, traveling when I could. And again, I have to elevate the mentors who are doing the work. That has been a constant in my life, looking to older Black women who are a few steps ahead of me and taking notes about what they're doing, especially as it relates to who I want to become and how I want to show up in the world. I mentioned earlier Yolanda Wisher and how she took me to Sonia Sanchez's house. And I think those type of connections has been a North Star that has led me to pay attention to my college professor, Farah Jasmine Griffin, when I was Professor Griffin, when I was at Columbia. Or even when I went to Black Girls Rock and got to see Beverly Bond and just like sit at the feet of someone who's putting work out in the world that is in alignment with why I believe I'm here. And even now, working under the genius of Professor Kimberly Crenshaw and all of my colleagues at AAPF, some of whom you've gotten to glean the wisdom from here today, I think that is all connected to how I'm learning to create my garden. Part of it is keeping company and working alongside people who are doing elements of what my soul is calling for me to do. Last but not least, I think that another important piece is creating communities of care, and that was elevated at the Labor of Love event we had earlier. The circles of community and care that I've created in my life remind me to love myself and others, to gather, to center joy and celebration and adventure. And last but not least, I want to also say, my daughter has been a reminder of how to water my garden, but also my purpose work to do work with the next generation of Black girls. As I mentioned, she's named after Zora Neale Hurston, who was a culture worker, an anthropologist, and a writer. So she was a thinker, a sayer, and a doer. And that's what I hope for my daughter and all Black girls, to know that what they think matters, to know that their creative ideas matter. And not only do they matter, they're essential, they're necessary for building a bold future. And so I'm thrilled that that work is also essential and centered here at AAPF with the work that we're doing with the Young Scholars Program.
I hear Zora.
Yes, living her best life, just
Best
happy,
life.
happy.
Best
And
life.
I'm telling you, she's a reminder for how
As
to water
she
my
should.
garden.
Yes, as she should. You know, it's interesting, as you were talking, I was already thinking about how so much of this made me think about Toni Cade Bambara in Salt Eaters when she said, "Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? Just so you're sure, right? And ready to be healed, because wholeness is no trifling matter. A lot of weight when you're well." And I just think about that and contextualizing that in what Dr. Venus said with "we are the garden." You know, we have the responsibility and the weight of caring for our mother's gardens, and that's us. What does that look like? That is just, it's a lot to hold. It's a legacy and a lineage that I just know you all like, oh my gosh, how to be a Black woman, right? Wouldn't want it any other way. And I just thank you all so much for your time, Shamina, Dr. Venus, Chandrea, for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us today. To have a film that talks about what radical intergenerational self-care and healing looks like is powerful in understanding the complex connections of love and lineage in our Black community. As the Her Dream Deferred program's last film screening and talkback event, we remind ourselves that Black women are often asked to take care of others, but rarely have time to take care of themselves. This stems from the intersectionality trauma of racism and sexism that generations of Black women have experienced. Today, as we fight back against the attacks on critical race theory that threaten the status of Black women in our society, we want to end on a note about the importance of racial and gender education and learning from Black women to ultimately save our society. This event and this entire week would not have been possible without the time and effort of our team at the African American Policy Forum. You have heard from a few of these brilliant sisters tonight, and the team is just all around brilliant. And we thank you for joining us at our final film screening and talkback. We hope you will join us for our final day, wellness activity on Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern. That is tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern. Visit www.aapf.org/HDD/2022 to register for the event. Or find the link in our bio at AA Policy Forum on Instagram or on our Facebook pages at the African American Policy Forum. Thank you all so much again for joining us today and this week. We hope you can stay connected with AAPF as we continue to advocate for Black women and girls across the country and the world. Ashe, you all have a great evening.
Say her name. Latanya Haggerty, say her name. Latanya Haggerty, say her name.